I thought this video was going to be about exploring and sharing the experiences of others. One of those essays where I take a topic outside of my area of expertise and interview people who know about it firsthand. We'd all learn something, I'd get to talk to some amazing folks, and then I'd start working on next month's video. But about halfway through my research for this video, I realised that I had to ask myself a question that I'd never considered. A question that cracked the foundations of this video's topic open. A question which made it a whole lot more wide-reaching and much more personal. Am I disfigured? Let's start at the beginning. Though some of us may dream of implanting our brains into a robot shell and never being perceived again, the reality is that we are trapped in these meat suits that we call bodies. We can go some way to change them, treat them, embellish them, and they can also be affected by external forces too, but they are with us our whole lives, and so we have to live with them. This is particularly true of our faces. In fact, when it comes to our face, it's not so much that we're living with it, but it is us. Faces are the way that we identify each other on a daily basis. They are unique. Even in identical twins, there'll be differences across the years. They are constantly on show in most cultures and are steeped in cultural mythology. The eyes are the window to the soul, as they say. Our faces portray our internal feelings with emotions playing out across our features. Our faces are where verbal communication comes from, our mouths, and also play a role in non-verbal communication too in languages like BSL. Their components are essential for our ability to survive through breathing, drinking, and eating. They are the sites of all five senses and house our brain, which controls it all. But faces and bodies are also the sites of attraction and beauty, visual avatars which can have a profound effect on our sense of self and on others' attitudes and treatments of us. What happens when this physical manifestation of you is not within the bounds of typical difference? What does it mean to be disfigured? I have a friend, Michaela, who wrote an amazing essay for my book Here and Queer, and who is a disfigured and disabled writer and advocate. I immediately knew that I wanted to interview her for this video. She's so smart and thoughtful and would no doubt have a bunch of insights into a world that I was so removed from. We fired up our webcams and mics and hopped on a call. And then, in the middle of talking to Michaela, I had a sudden revelation. This realization then became even more stark when I read into influencer Nikki Lilly. The answer to the question, am I disfigured, became suddenly and obviously yes. So as it turns out, me and Nikki Lilly actually have the same condition, AVM or arteriovenous malformation. My blood vessels, like hers, are malformed. It means that, amongst other things, I can't control my internal body temperature, I have issues with hypermobility, and one half of my body is actually bigger than the other. But the way that it manifests visually, for me, the way in which other people can see it, it's the kind of thing that I can bring out as a party trick that ends in fascination rather than a sense of fear or discomfort. I also have another condition, endometriosis. That means that I have these uncontrollable growths which cause debilitating pain, but they're inside my body and therefore can't be seen. Quite literally, I am disfigured, malformed. I have biological conditions which have altered the way that my body should look. In my case, in ways which are medically troubling, which mean that these parts of me don't work as they're meant to. I've had multiple surgeries to help treat these conditions. I've ongoing medical treatment and medication to help with symptoms. Yet myself and Michaela and Nikki experience disfigurement in vastly different ways. If you watch my videos, then you probably love the idea of getting discounted books delivered straight to your door, all newly released titles from authors that you might otherwise never have discovered. Yes, it's time for a quick ad from returning sponsor, Book of the Month, supporting the channel once again and sending us some incredible reads. Well, hello, Steffi. Do you want to be in this video? This month I lent into the festive season and picked an all-queer cast rom-com, Most Wonderful by Georgia Clark, about the Belvedere siblings and their holiday romances. There's the showrunner with a huge crush on her leading lady, a stand-up comedian who is a master of self-destruction, and the younger brother who's just been dumped, during his marriage proposal. I personally cannot wait to fall in love with all of them. I also decided on a second pick that was completely different to that. This is Homeseeking by Carissa Chen, a literary epic debut novel about one couple told out of order through 60 years. It's a super simple concept. You just pick the books that you want from their monthly selection of curated titles that always have a great range of genres and tones and themes to them, and then they give you the best prices on new release hardback fiction, as well as free shipping and a loyalty rewards program too for even more discounts. I mentioned earlier this is a debut, which means it's the author's first published novel, and that is very exciting to me for two reasons. One, Book of the Month includes a lot of debuts in their picks, and that means that these authors who otherwise wouldn't have an audience, a ready-made audience, often have issues with like people being able to discover their work, have this ready-made platform, which is kind of so exciting for up-and-coming writers. But also as a reader, you get to read someone's first book and potentially connect with it. It might end up being your favorite book, and then you're there at the beginning of their writing journey. You can support that writer in like everything they do going forwards, and that to me is so exciting. And since this is the season of giving, you can save up to $30 on gift memberships right now. Just check out the gifting page to learn more. So if that sounds like your kind of thing, then head over to bookofthemonth.com to pick a book and join Book of the Month today. For a limited time, you can join and get the first book for just $5 with the code TINSEL. And both new and existing members will also receive a fun holiday-themed sticker pack in their December box. What is disfigurement anyway? So I don't normally go in for the whole dictionary definition thing, but this time the dictionary definitions do highlight something that I think is key. So Merriam-Webster defines disfigurement as to impair, as in beauty, by deep and persistent injuries. And Oxford Languages defines disfigurement as the action of spoiling the appearance of something or someone, defacement. Here we can start to kind of see how disfigurement definitions focus on how a person and their beauty is altered, specifically for the worst. They are spoiled and impaired. Disfigurement is positioned against a norm of how a human body should typically look. As a verb, disfigure, according to the Cambridge Dictionary, is to spoil the appearance of something or someone, especially their face, completely. She was horribly disfigured by burns. This definition of disfigure is interesting to me because it explicitly points out the face. While it could include any part of a person's body, they specifically mention how disfigurement can happen especially to the face. The question is, what is counted as disfigurement then? Does a disfigurement need to be permanent? Is a person disfigured if they have a scar or growth on their leg, on their hip, on their elbow? And why is it that disfigurement is about spoiling or impairing beauty? When you start researching a topic like this, often definitions themselves are the first hurdle you come across, because there's the dictionary definition, the technical definition, but there's also the way that the word is used in the real world, and especially the definition that people who are actually part of an experience use amongst themselves and with others. Often these definitions and words are vastly different to each other. So, in talking with Michaela, I asked her about her thoughts on what disfigurement means.
It encompasses the facial disfigurement that I have, which comes from a craniosynostosis condition, one of the conditions that fall under the umbrella of craniosynostosis called Crouzon syndrome. And that's a genetic that came about when I was born. But it encompasses that and how that makes my face look different, look odd, look perhaps to some people, to some eyes, ugly or untoward, off-putting, whatever. If I'm defining it, disfigured also goes across to things which aren't in my experience, like limb differences and other forms of facial disfigurement. That's how I define it. Some folks, it has wider and narrower definitions, and that's fine. If I were to describe myself as visibly different, that's like just the start of it. Like, it doesn't really, it's not specific enough for me. But I recognize that it's a more accessible descriptor that the community and organizations that focus on disfigurement and visible differences has taken charge of and are happy using. I guess I wish that there was more of a move to reclaim words like disfigured or deformed in the same way that disabled people, of which I also include myself, have reclaimed disabled as a positive, as a descriptor, or even just as a neutral descriptor.
So even beyond dictionary definitions, there's a wide way that people use the word disfigured or not to describe themselves. As Michaela mentioned, the words visible differences have also been and currently are used to describe disfigurement. And so throughout this video, depending on the source of information that I found, I might use one or the other term interchangeably. Changing Faces, which is an organisation based in the UK that focuses on advocacy, education and support for people with visible differences, discusses on their website some examples of how this might apply. Burns, scars and marks, cancer treatments, which can leave a huge range of visible changes on the body, scarring from an accident, cleft palates and other cranial or facial conditions, limb differences or amputations, paralysis conditions like Bell's palsy, scarring, discoloration and other markings from skin conditions. It was here again that my journey through the research for this video took another unexpected turn, because I messaged Changing Faces to see if they knew anyone who would be interested in being interviewed for this video. And they replied after I'd already spoken to Michaela and started questioning my own relationship to disfigurement. But it only then complicated that relationship more. They said, "Hey Rowan, we have someone who's perfect. In the meantime, would you be willing to work with us on a real story for our website and social channels? Your video about acne representation is so interesting, and I'm sure your experiences would resonate with a lot of our supporters." Oh shit. Scarring, discoloration, and other markings from skin conditions. That is acne. I mean, acne is a condition that I've had for 20 years, one that I made a whole deep dive video essay on, for God's sake, where I looked at how people with acne are treated, portrayed, and how it impacts people's lives. I spoke about the evidence of discrimination, the roots of these feelings, and extensively about my own relationship with the condition. And it struck me that, in many ways, I've already made a video about my own disfigurement. I have long been diagnosed with severe acne vulgaris. I've spent countless hours and thousands of pounds on treatments and medications. I've reckoned with the psychological significance of having such visible markings on my face in particular. I've worn makeup in every video that I've ever posted on this channel. I've edited photos to get rid of my acne to post them online, but it wasn't until that casual email from a leading disfigurement organisation that I connected that experience with the idea of disfigurement. So yeah, this video isn't about an experience that I'm viewing from the outside at all. It's undeniably a part of my own inescapable meat suit, inside and out. And as I write this, I'm still not sure how that's going to affect where this video goes. So I guess let's find out together. Born or becoming? By now, your brain, being the categorizing fiend that it is, might have already put together that there are some people with types of disfigurement that are present from birth, but there are also those who become disfigured later in life. There's people whose disfigurement, whenever and however it occurs, stays the same, and there are those who have it change, sometimes on a daily basis. And God, just laying that out now, I am so aware that that ever-changing element is one of the hardest things about acne for me. For most of my life, I've not been able to have a permanent sense of visual self. I could get new breakouts from waking up to getting home from work, but I'm also very aware that about 6 months ago, I found a medication which has worked to reduce my active acne to basically nothing. I still have the texture, scarring and discoloration that's left over, but the painful cysts are pretty much gone. The changeable nature of the condition that was so hard for me for so long is also the thing that allowed it to reduce. And I can't help but wonder how I would feel if acne was a type of unchanging condition where I had a permanent set of cysts and pustules. Would it have been easier to accept as me? Sorry, as I was saying, It might be easy to see people who have had a disfigurement for as long as they've been alive and those who might have recently become disfigured as having entirely different experiences. After all, the second set of people have been treated as someone without a disfigurement their whole lives and are now adjusting to a new reality. But the research findings from various studies seem to vary wildly. There's no definitive conclusion of like this group specifically experiences life in this way. The crossover between the two is huge. To generalize any research findings as universal is, well, kind of impossible on this topic. But there is usefulness in studies that conclude with, well, what some might see as a lack of conclusion. When they've been commissioned to help inform policy and healthcare, encouraging the idea that people can't be sorted into neat categories and treated with blanket assumptions is itself kind of useful. For example, I read a thesis paper entitled Looking Inside the Face: Experiences of Living with an Accidentally Acquired Facial Disfigurement and Its Perceived Impact on Identity, which discusses how some researchers suggested that individuals who are born with a disfigurement go through a different psychological process around it from those who are disfigured later in life. The writer explains the idea that individuals with a congenital disfigurement are more likely to incorporate their visual difference as part of the self and adapt to living in this way, whereas those who have an altered appearance later in life are more likely to face a loss of sense of self and identity because the way that they were is suddenly no more. These people are faced with reconsidering who they are along with having to adjust to the stigma of looking different. One study of patients with head and neck cancer found participants became more withdrawn from society and their personalities are changed, leaving them confused about who they were and how they experienced their identities. But that participants eventually defined a new self and discovered a sense of belonging with others who had overcome a similar experience of acquiring a disfigurement. That being said, there's also been research that contradicts these ideas of difference. One study from just last year tried to understand the psychological outcomes of people with congenital or acquired physical differences. In a survey of over 330 people, they tested whether each group would predict certain psychosocial outcomes: appearance satisfaction, social appearance anxiety, life disengagement, and intimacy distress. They made sure to test the data against different demographic groups, visible difference characteristics, and their histories. And with all regression models tested and checked, they found that congenital versus acquired visible difference did not predict psychosocial outcomes. With researchers concluding, across the wide spectrum of causes of visible difference, the timing of one's difference appears less consequential than individuals' level of optimism, perceived social support, and the extent to which they feel they can disguise their difference. The existence of these conflicting studies has useful implications, I think. For example, that mental health support after disfigurement shouldn't be awarded or denied based on the clinician's opinion of how severe the disfigurement is, as it doesn't necessarily correspond with the patient's level of need. And then there's the way that we place moral or emotional judgments on beauty standards, like being a soldier and having an amputation may be perceived as brave. A burn victim survivor might be regarded with pity, and someone born with a facial deformity might be viewed with an instinctual disgust by some without the context of worthy suffering that transforms the disfiguration into a sacrifice or victim-marking acquisition. Overall, though, almost all the work that I've read has agreed that the psychological impact of living in a society that has pretty consistently devalued disfigured people has led to many experiencing low self-esteem, depression, anxiety, and even suicidality at some point in their lives. Chronic stigmatization and discrimination take an immense toll on anyone, no matter how they became disfigured in the first place. There was a whole year at university where I wouldn't let people photograph my face. I'd turn away from the camera, bury my skin in a friend's jumper, ignore the calls to turn around. I was pulled out of uni that year for fears over my mental health. Internal versus external. Is there a quantifiable difference between those who have an externally visible disfigurement versus those with an internal invisible malformation? I think many people looking on would assume that that's a ridiculous question. Of course, someone with a visible disfigurement has it worse, right? I think when I first realised that I had the same condition as Nikki Lilly, it didn't feel right for me to use disfigured about myself. It just felt like I hadn't, earned it. Why was that? What did earning it mean? Was earning about suffering the same negativity and severity of judgment from others? Was this about not wanting to claim an identity or struggle that I didn't truly belong to, about not wanting to make it about me? Or was it something worse? Was it based on the idea that my malformations weren't bad enough? And if it was based on that idea, what did that mean that I was internalizing about other disfigured people? And that word, bad. It's important here, I think, to emphasize the feelings of observers of disfigurement do not necessarily map onto the feelings of the disfigured person being observed. The assumption that the more visible a disfigurement, the worse the person must feel about themselves is based on outsider judgment and projected assumptions. In one study in the Journal of Psychosomatic Research from the 90s, which compared the body-related attitudes of groups of women suffering from physical conditions that are commonly regarded as being disfiguring and or disabling, they actually found that despite their conditions, the women did not necessarily disparage their bodies. They also seemed to worry less about small changes in weight and shape than did comparable women without physical difficulties, and to have an enhanced sense of their own robustness. And in fact, although most of the women that we studied did feel somewhat less attractive to the opposite sex than community controls, that only reached a statistically significant level in one group. Interestingly, that was the group that suffered a metabolic condition that has no immediate visible manifestations. Another study from 2019, looking at the idea of identity shift after acquired disfigurement in British adults, found that although on the surface there were significant negative impacts post-disfigurement, these impacts were often tied to other factors. Prior to facial cancer, one participant, Jonathan, identified as a successful family man in control of his life, his career, his finances, and his future. A late diagnosis and 2 courses of cancer treatment tore through his perceptions of control. Yes, disfigurement is a source of lost control, but so is serious medical diagnoses, intensive treatments, and the ensuing financial impacts. He told researchers, "It was hard at 53, you're in your swing there. You're really going. Both kids had left home, both 2 nice incomes coming in, 2 cars, and all of a sudden you're on £68.90. I think I was on 3 months sick pay, but after then, it was, what can you do?" That same study concluded that associated existential threats and their treatments, for example for cancer, had the potential to disrupt perceived selves and futures far more than an altered appearance. These combined experiences could lead to ongoing liminal states, as participants lived between life and death, health and illness, corporeal wholeness and damage, ability and disability, and anticipated perceptions and realities, and with competing emotional states. That idea of illness and treatment creating a destabilizing liminal space is something that has been often observed in Western healthcare traditions. You're in an unfamiliar environment, in pain, often in a state of uncertainty as to your future. There is fear, there is a lack of control over your space, your routine, and especially over your own body. You might be on medication that makes you confused, drowsy, or unconscious. You're aware of this building as a place where every day there are people on the threshold of life and death. Those are all things that can have an effect on a sense of self, of certainty, of identity, and of body, alongside any physical changes or disfigurations. There is a historical precedent through religious dogma in the West to codifying visible difference as more than just a simple variation from the norm visually. In a culture that hinges on the idea of God being a perfect, all-powerful being, where evidence of his existence comes from the perfect design of the universe that could never have happened by chance, where does that leave those that aren't of perfect design? As scholar Roger Lund explains, the unforeseen consequences of the argument from design, which insisted on the symmetry and form of the material creation, including human beings themselves, because such a theory failed to account for the asymmetrical, the monstrous, and the physically deformed, observers could only conclude that such creatures were accidents, anomalies, or the products of moral transgressions. This is a clear example of dysfiguromysia, a term that was actually coined by Michaela, referring to the erasure of and prejudice against disfigured or visibly different people. The visibility in this way is the defining factor of the disfigured definition, not the idea of impairment or suffering or blemish. When looking at people whose disfigurement is visible compared to those where it's hidden or internal, it's undeniable that those with visible differences are distinct in their experience of immediate outsider and observer reactions and potential judgments. Disfigurement internally might be biologically similar to external disfigurement, Like, if the growths and malformations inside me were on the surface, there would be no questioning the disfigurement label of my endometriosis, for example. But being internal is significant because it essentially protects you from this particular prejudice. It's the reason that visibly different and disfigured are used interchangeably by so many. It's understood that that disfigurement will be visible. It's this dysfiguromysia which is behind the mental health risks for those with visible differences, in a similar way to the impact of transphobia and homophobia onto the queer community statistics over the years. In The Psychological Burden of Visible Disfigurement Following Traumatic Injury, scholar David B. Sawyer gives a full paragraph of existing examples as a background to his research, including statistics around a study from the 90s looking at people with cleft lip and palate and craniofacial abnormalities, where 56% of patients with facial disfigurement were judged in need of mental health treatment, and one from the mid-2000s which found across 458 adult participants, 48% were judged to have symptoms of an anxiety disorder and 28% had depression, along with a dozen other examples all supporting this connection between mental health and experiences of disfigurement. I spoke to Changing Faces campaigner Bronwyn, and she told me about the split between her perception of self as a child before she entered secondary school and encountered bullying and abuse because of her appearance. This is similar to a number of testimonials that I've seen across my research. The visible differences in childhood hadn't marked people out as different in a negative way, but instead had been seen at that age as part of typical human variation in a way that a different ear size or hair colour might have been. My acne had always been visible, and the reactions to it over the years had caused suffering and ultimately dictated my own perception of the condition. It was painful, yes, physically as well as emotionally. It caused my face to bleed, bruise, split, it was swollen and tender. But the physical symptoms of my internal malformations have caused much more pain. They've left me bedbound at times, vomiting from how much it hurt. I've needed surgeries to try and slow the spread. Long before COVID made it the new normal, I had to disclose before taking a job that I would need support to work from home for extended periods during flare-ups. But on the other hand, God, that external element of acne. If I'm really truly honest with you, I asked myself a question while writing this script. If I was given a choice between a life where I had clear skin but still had to suffer with these internal conditions, or never had the internal issues but kept the long-term ever-present acne that I've had most of my life, which would I choose? Looking back at the mental toll that it's taken on me, the effects it's had on my self-image, if I'm really truly honest, I don't know the answer. And fuck, what does that say about me? The new acne medication that I'm taking has a bunch of potential side effects, and although no serious ones have affected me so far, what would it take for me to stop taking them? Which side effect would be too much? And do I trust myself to draw that line? Disfigurement in pop culture. Like so many experiences and identities, the prevailing ideas of disfigurement are substantiated and sustained by media representation. When it comes to disfigurement, there is this triad of models in fictional pop culture: the evil villain, the pitied figure, and the often dehumanized inspiration. It's not hard to find evidence of each, so let's start with the villains. Scar, Freddy Krueger, Darth Vader, Two-Face, the Joker, Hook, Silver. From fairy tales to Bond villains, there is a consistency here that isn't coincidence. It's all tied to what sociologist Antti Synot calls the beauty mystique. The belief that the beautiful is good and that the ugly is evil, and conversely that the morally good is physically beautiful or good looking and the evil is ugly. Thus, the physical and the metaphysical, body and soul, appearance and reality, inner and outer, are one. So when creating a villain, there is an expectation of presenting that evil across their face or body as well as in their actions. That physical evil is often something that removes them from the normal hero character, things like queerness, fatness, or in these examples, disfigurement. It's important to note that although sometimes this disfigurement is simply set dressing, as it were, there are also many examples of it compounding the villainous actions. The disfigurement is a source of shame, bitterness, or a moral motivation. They want revenge, or to cover the beautiful love interest they can't have, or betray their cowardice through crocodile-related PTSD, for example. Changing Faces actually launched a campaign to highlight and challenge this trope in 2018 called I Am Not Your Villain. The British Film Institute backed the mission, pledging to no longer fund films that included villains with facial scarring. Some representations exploit the widespread assumptions around disfigured characters to give us fake-out villains. Think about the ghosts in The Sixth Sense with their burned faces and open wounds, or the central haunting figure of the boy in the orphanage. The fear in the main characters, and initially the audience, is encouraged through the use of disfigurement, only for it to be revealed that these figures are themselves simply victims in need of aid. Which brings us to the figure of the pitiable disfigured character. These are characters like the ghosts I just mentioned, whose role in the story is often victimhood, and whose disfigurement doubles down on this idea. Think about Shireen in Game of Thrones, or the Elephant Man in The Elephant Man. Even a film like Wonder, which positions main character Oggy as an active protagonist, also creates a finale where he is given a medal for courage and bravery for just being disfigured, and I guess getting through his time at school despite that. And this again leads to the final point of the triangle, the inspiration porn type figure. This is often seen in the coverage of disfigurement and ties in with similar representation of disability. The two often go hand in hand together, in fact. An individual becomes a lesson for onlookers about appreciating what they have, or carrying a message of, if they can do it, so can you. You know, like those memes with amputees at the gym with captions like, what's your excuse? Few depictions of disfigurement have put a real disfigured person in the starring role, not an actor in a mask or using prosthetics or CGI in post-production, and not as a side role, but an actual focused protagonist. But I actually started thinking about this as a potential topic for a video after seeing Adam Pearson had a new film coming out called A Different Man with Sebastian Stan, directed by Aaron Schimberg, who himself was born with a cleft palate. He said of his condition, "It's self-evident and it has affected me. It affected everything about me, and I'm still dealing with it. Not only having a cleft palate, but having as many surgeries as I did, and having my face change over time. The face that I have is not really the face I was born with. I never felt that any movie that dealt with the subject spoke to me, or if it spoke to me, it only confirmed what I feared that everybody was thinking about me was true." The movie is a brilliant psychological thriller with these moments of comedy and film noir style paranoia, focusing around an aspiring actor, Edward. He's socially anxious, unable to pursue romantic relationships, and constantly aware of the stares and comments he receives because of the way he looks. The way these moments pan out on screen is expertly done, laid one after the other as we see him go through his day at the start of the film. They're ambiguous enough that we're left unsure if the comments and reactions are all due to his appearance. His new next-door neighbour jumps in shock when she sees him, but is that because of his face, or because she wasn't expecting someone to suddenly appear behind her in the corridor? Someone makes a comment about peace coming to those that accept life as it is. Is that a weird patronising response to his disfigurement, encouraging him to, find peace that the man is assuming that he couldn't possibly have found himself in his appearance? Or is it just him being one of those people who have woo-woo type beliefs? And when his love interest asks him what happened as she bandages his bleeding finger, is she asking about how he got the cut, or about his disfigurement itself? Edward's experiences through life have left him framing every interaction through this lens. He elects to go through an experimental treatment to transform his face, completely removing his disfigurement. But life on the other side of that decision isn't as idyllic as he'd hoped. Now, I don't have the same condition as Edward. He has a different job to me, a different sexuality, gender, background, personality. And yeah, when I watched the film, the underlying questions at the heart of the story hit me like a truck. Questions that Schimberg has spoken about having himself after meeting Pearson and being struck by his self-confidence and ownership of his disfigurement. Meeting him and seeing that threw me into a kind of identity crisis. I really wondered, does my social anxiety and the way I am come from having a cleft palate, or is that something I'd always assumed? Meeting Adam, I thought, did it have to be this way? Is this not how I'm supposed to act? Even today, could I change? Could I become a different person? Do I want to become a different person? Have I leaned on this like a crutch? It brought up all sorts of questions for me. It took me back to that question I asked earlier. If I would choose a life without acne, if it would be possible for me to live a life with acne that was devoid of anxiety and self-doubt, or if my own nature and the messaging from the world around me would always bring me back here. And the messaging isn't just in fictional media. In a study from 2018, which sampled 300 broadsheets articles that included disfigurement, researchers found adverbs utilized to frame disfigurement include horribly, badly, hideously, terribly, desperately, horrendously, and terrifyingly. Only 5% of the Sun articles and 2% of the Mirror articles reported on cases where disfigurement had existed as a congenital condition. This suggests that facial disfigurements are framed as conditions that are acquired as a result of a crime or a specific incident, such as an accident at work. The media failed to represent the breadth of facial disfigurements, but instead focus on constructing tense before and after stories. So we can see how even within factual media, the lens through which disfigurement is presented is very narrow and specific, tied, as I'll talk about in more depth later, to a capitalistic pressure to sensationalize. But what are the impacts of these types of representation? There's actually a study published last year about this, using a short documentary about people with scars to measure participants' intentions to behave in stigmatizing ways towards those with visible differences, as well as the impacts on their wide ideas of beauty and self-image. In their words, the findings from this study suggest that a 20-minute documentary depicting the experiences of real people with real scars had a beneficial impact on how people feel about their own appearance, body esteem, appearance in general, conceptualization of beauty, and their views towards people with scars. Cited reasons included the importance of media representation, the power of the media to normalize difference and educate, the ability for the media to be engaging and emotionally powerful, and the benefit of personal stories. And this is pretty in line with the impact that we see in representation of marginalized or othered groups in other studies. An impact that can go both ways, with the negative and stereotypical portrayals, evidence to reinforce these beliefs or even create them in viewers, especially those with limited contact with these groups in their own lives. Interestingly, when you go searching for these types of studies and research, they're almost entirely about the impact on other people and the way that it changes or doesn't change the way that they view and even treat those who are disfigured. The literature around how representation impacts disfigured people themselves is kind of lacking.
It kind of made me prepare for a future of just being alone, even though that's not what I wanted, because, you see, I guess like films and TV doesn't really help. You see sort of this ideal future, and it's something that I grew up believing I wanted, and it's not something really I'd say I don't want. I do. It is something that I still want in terms of being able to, have like a husband and a family, but all of that kind of seemed a little bit hopeless at the time, because I was, like I say, made to believe that I would never be attractive enough to have a partner. So I kind of just gave up hope that that kind of future was even possible. It was good in a way, because I really started to focus on myself and my independence and what a life could look like, just me, myself and I. But I think it sort of prevented me from allowing someone into my life in that kind of way. So for the first time that I was asked out, I kind of, like I say, as much as this was something that I'd always wanted, I sort of really struggled with it, because I'd full on internalized this belief that I was never good enough for it, and that, it wouldn't end well.
I've wondered for a long time what my sense of self would be like if I'd seen characters with acne on screen. That study with the short documentary on scars, it sounds nice, but are concepts of beauty really so easily changed? Would half an hour watching people with acne talk about their experiences have made a difference? Would my self-acceptance have been possible without knowing that those without acne had watched and responded that way too? Did I need the world around me to change their attitudes and biases for it to be truly possible for me to escape my own self-doubts? Beauty standards and public perception. Okay, stay with me on this next sentence. Reality is not the same as objective truth. What I mean in practice is that someone's disfigurement can fall outside of the bounds of current mainstream definitions of beauty in our lived reality, but that doesn't mean that a lack of beauty is objectively true, not just in terms of individual preferences being varied, but also just in a general sense. why does this shape or size of flesh on top of bone determine beauty? With all the variation in the world, what even determines normal? There are lots of theories about beauty, that it relies on symmetry, on averageness, on proportionality, but through history and across cultures, the concept of what is deemed beautiful has changed. Indeed, beauty standards across gender, sexuality, class, and more within the same culture can be hugely varied. But those standards, when you are living through them, do have an impact. Black philosopher Paul C. Taylor has written on the connections between beauty and race. The most prominent type of racialized ranking represents blackness as a condition to be despised, and most tokens of this type extend this attitude to cover the physical features that are central to the ascription of black identity. So a central assumption has been that black folks, with our kinky hair, flat noses, thick lips, dark skin, are ugly. I call to your attention the evaluative overtones of this standard descriptive language. Imagine the difference if I had said broad noses, full lips, curly hair, and so on. Notice how the offerings for plastic surgeries to change the shape of a woman's nose for cosmetic purposes, for example, are not a long list of diverse shapes and sizes, with the goal being allowing her to choose what suits her best. They're all about making them smaller, straighter, skinnier. These skis slope lift, the elven button nose, the shaving down of ethnic bumps or hooks. When we see a before and after picture, we know which is which, because we know the ideal is whatever is closest to a particular kind of white feature. It was thematically fitting, I think, for the characters of A Different Man to be reading Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye. It's a novel that revolves around a black girl who is repeatedly regarded by herself and the world around her as ugly due to her blackness. This becomes the foundation of a kind of spiral out of control, mirroring the similar descent into madness narrative that we see from the disfigured protagonist of A Different Man itself. Similarly, when we're talking about social stigma and bodies, we might look at the prevalence of fat phobia in society. Michaela made the connection between the emotional and negative reaction to disfigurement and to fatness when we talked.
I very strongly consider fat liberation and disfigurement activism to be hand in hand. I'm very passionate about the sort of same but differentness of our different fields, and I consider it a responsibility that if I practice disfigurement activism, I need to practice fat positive or fat liberatory activism as well. And I appreciate you highlighting that link.
As we've talked about already, the definition of disfigurement has long been tied to the ideas of an inherently negative change or difference. Despite the variation of what is regarded as beautiful, conditions which are seen as disfiguring seem much more universal in comparison. It's a phenomenon which has been explored by a number of researchers that leads to suggestions of evolutionary disease avoidance, referring to a natural avoidance of anyone with differences that could suggest someone is contagious. Scarring from conditions like leprosy, pox, and plague would be visible evidence historically of danger, and so the theory goes that maybe this is a survival instinct that manifests as avoidance, disgust, or lack of attraction towards those with similar disfigurements. Even for disfigured people whose visible differences weren't the same as those caused by such conditions, the effect can be the same. One study, for example, compared reactions to participants asked to handle props that they'd seen previously used by other people, including those with facial birthmarks and those displaying flu-like symptoms, as well as controls. Their reactions to those with visible and known contagious disease and those with a disfigurement produced a similar level of response, visible disgust, and resulted in a number of participants in each group refusing to touch the prop at all. 50% of people thought acne was contagious in a study published by the American Academy of Dermatology. I've said that stat before. In my video about acne, I've talked about this all before. 68% said that they wouldn't find someone with acne attractive. 41.1% said that they would feel uncomfortable being seen in public with someone with acne. 44.6% said that they would feel uncomfortable touching them. And the funny thing is, knowing what researchers have concluded about you, doesn't make it hurt any less. It isn't just about individuals feeling attractive or not. The level of stigma that we see in response to disfigured faces has been shown to be similar to previously reported neural responses to stigmatized outgroups like homeless people and drug addicts. It's a social judgment, a wider set of cultural implications. In 2019, a study was published that looked at the reactions of members of the public to disfigured people that concluded the current research revealed that in everyday aesthetic judgments, the emotional responses to and negative stereotypes of people with facial disfigurement may drive discrimination in social, academic, and professional contexts. People with disfigurement are perceived as having less desirable personality traits, e.g. emotional stability, conscientiousness, internal attributes, e.g. happiness and intelligence, and social attributes, e.g. trustworthiness and popularity. These subjective judgments were further reduced to people with disfigurement being regarded as less sociable and happy, less dominant, less emotionally stable, and more as objects of curiosity. The ultimate recommendation was for social interventions to break down these assumptions and biases and improve disfigured people's treatment. But that isn't the universal focus of those looking to improve the treatment of disfigured people. For some, surgery is the primary solution. One research paper from 2022, which summarizes the literature on the psychosocial burden experienced by those who have visible disfigurement, concluded, encouragingly, plastic surgical procedures that minimize disfigurement result in more positive perceptions of individuals with disfigurement. I mean, who knew a society which has a stigma against visibly different people would treat them better when they looked less visibly different? It's that word encouragingly that gets me here. The sort of excitement that fixing these people is working. That same word appears in other pieces of research too. Encouragingly, our findings suggest that surgical treatment of disfigurement mitigates the negative effects of disfigurement. I mean, in a world where people with normal faces are having surgery to chase a version of personal or social perfection, is it any wonder that there's an expectation of those with disfigurement to do the same? Bronwyn spoke to me about how difficult the decision was to reject the offer of surgery that would be for cosmetic and not medical reasons when it finally came.
As I got older, I was offered more cosmetic surgery. It was a decision I found really difficult to make, actually, because up until that point, all of my operations had been to help my nose, my face, my lips, whatever, function better. And so there was always a need for that change. And I kind of just accepted the way that I looked after that because I was like a functioning human. But then when I was sort of offered to make cosmetic changes, I think even just the offer in itself made me think, does that mean I need to change? Like, do they see a problem with the way I look because they're offering a change to it? And I found it really difficult to decide whether it was what I wanted or whether it's what I thought other people wanted me to do. And eventually I did decide that I didn't want any cosmetic changes. So my most recent surgery was to sort of help my nose function better. But I said, you know, if possible, I really don't want to change the way it looks because it's taken me years already to get to the point of loving and accepting this. And you know, why would I want to change that and go back on all those years of work? It was definitely difficult to make that decision because it literally felt like I was being sort of encouraged to change because I wasn't how I was meant to look.
I think back on my questions from earlier, whether my sense of my own capacity for beauty, my self-consciousness around my skin could be alleviated by media messaging, by stories of everyone being beautiful in their own way, or fictionalized happiness for people who looked like me. And with the reality I was experiencing, the reactions of those around me stopped me believing it to be anything but a platitude from someone who doesn't actually understand. I went to the library last week to see if they had any books about disfigurement to read for this video's research, and I was pointed to a number of books in a series published in the late 2000s. Coping Successfully With was the series name. The number of titles shelved together in a neat row. Coping successfully with acne, with psoriasis, with eczema. And inside were chapters like the psychological effects of acne and camouflage, with lines like, the most important step towards managing your acne is making sure to treat it as soon as possible. The idea of embracing, of loving, of accepting wasn't anywhere to be found. Some of the books contained brief chapters near the end about the mental health of sufferers, but mainly talked about spotting the signs of depression and suicide. They were treated more as understandable, as inevitable, and it was more about spotting the warning signs. I thought back to a day when I was on that mental health leave from university, when my mum brought me up to London to have lunch with some of her friends. I spent much of the previous months in bed, unable to get out of the house, and this wasn't all to do with the way that I looked, but that was definitely a part of the particular mental health crisis I was going through at the time. We went to a makeup counter and I was offered a free mini makeover. Oh, how nice, my mum said. What a lovely treat. The woman removed my makeup and then reapplied a full face of her own products. By the end, as I looked in the mirror, it was clear that she kind of had no idea how to deal with acne skin. Every red, swollen blemish, every flake of dry skin, every enlarged pore looked like it had been highlighted. And I felt so suddenly out of control, so inwardly disgusting. I locked myself in a stall in the store toilets and barely staved off a full-blown panic attack. When I could finally talk again, I gave my mum my card and begged her to buy this list of items from the shop that I'd written down, this kind of bare minimum list that I would need to remove and reapply kind of my makeup with my own tried and tested products. The idea of her friends seeing me like this, of anyone seeing me, was wildly unbearable. In truth, I didn't care how much it cost to fulfill that list. The money would be worth it. I've never felt that way towards other people with acne though. So why did I feel such a deep and profound discomfort with my own skin? Speaking to Bronwen, it became clear that we had very similar experiences when it came to our perceptions of ourselves as teenagers, the nature of the bullying we received, and our beliefs about our chances of finding a romantic partner because of that.
I think the timing of this bullying and sort of where you were at in life at that point really sort of came together and made me sort of believe that I would never be able to have a relationship, because clearly I'm not attractive. Clearly I don't look the way that I should. And, it was actually, even those words were actually said to me, you're never going to get a boyfriend looking like that. So of course that's become like a fixed internal belief that is it for me now, which luckily, that belief was crushed when someone did ask me out. But the point is, that was literally something that I held for years, because I was made to believe that you're clearly not beautiful enough for people to find you attractive, for people to want to be in a relationship with you if you look the way you do. And also, when I was at school, a lot of the bullying sort of manifested in, guys playing games, trying to dare each other to come and ask me out, or in these sort of really sarcastic ways. It was almost like a daring game, or like a bet that they had with each other. And so of course for me to know that they see me as some kind of butt of a joke or subject of a game made me think I am literally just a laughing stock, and that is it. There's nothing more to it.
The relationship between attraction, convention, and expectation could honestly be its own entire video essay. Where is the line between genuine innate attraction and social pressure and subjectivity? In our interview, Michaela spoke about always interrogating the things that you find attractive and why, which I think is a key step beyond these kind of interventions around disfigurement, which are more PSA style videos about being nice to people who are different. There's a satirical style version of such a PSA video for offices in A Different Man, where they encourage workers to basically still talk to their disfigured teammates and not, socially isolate them, but in this cheery way that kind of just makes it seem even more ridiculous that people would have to be told to do this. Because that can't be the goal, right? It can't just be a choice between cosmetic surgery or anti-bullying training. Surely we can also be driving towards a deeper unpacking of attraction, beauty, normality, and dehumanization. Speaking to Michaela, I was surprised to hear her say this about her worries around dating.
My relationship is a long-distance one. We met online, and it took a few months for me to be able to go and see my partner. And I spent quite a few of those months a little worried that she would be surprised by how I appeared in real life. She had plenty of photos. She'd seen me on Skype. But I remember times when I was really worried that my own slight odd curvature of my spine might be a surprise to her, and my gait might be odd, and she might be taken aback by that and less attracted to me in person. And I'm not going to say that I think that was entirely unwarranted. In my case, it proved to be unwarranted. It wasn't anything. But I think, especially in a world where people just don't really think about disfigured people in general and don't really think about the possibility of being attracted to us, I think it's relevant.
Because I know Michaela and her girlfriend Sarah. I've spent time with them in person together. They are extremely adorable and very heart eyes in love. And the idea that even after so long dating online, that Sarah would be anything other than enamored with Michaela right back, it felt so jarring to me. But I mean, looking back at not just the beauty standards, but the romantic narratives that we've seen over the centuries, what has there been to give Michaela or any of us an alternative to disfigured people being alone? Disfigured characters in romantic stories, think about Beastly, Penelope, Beauty and the Beast, they might experience love once someone has, seen beneath the way they look, but then they're transformed in the end nonetheless. They're so often not permitted to be loved as they already were. They're rewarded for being a good person, ensuring that their outward appearance mirrors that beauty and goodness are the same thing philosophy. The implications are inescapable. Capitalism and income. An article from last year entitled Tales from the Crypt, a psychoanalytic approach to disability representation and advertising concluded, representation is key in the politics of mass-mediated consumer society. When this is turned to the world of marketing, the current trend is clear. Consumer culture tends to glorify the supercrip, a disabled individual whose recognition in society largely depends on the extent to which they are perceived by the public as having defeated their disabilities, thus meeting able-bodied standards. Much like a lot of other areas of inequality, we can connect the little red strings of each thread of disfigurement back to ye olde capitalism, that bad boy that loves to elevate profit over people. Market capitalism has us in this weird place where some representations of disabled and disfigured people represent these very particular narratives of heroism and inspiration, or objects of pity, thus utilizing disabled representation to sell goods and services, hawking the allure of aspirational individuality rather than making note of any kind of structurally oppressive forces at play. A 2023 report noted that depictions of disability in advertising are rare, so rare in fact that only 4% of people represented in advertising campaigns are disabled, which is wildly below the percentage of actual disabled people. And even within this small percentage of diverse representation we're seeing, it still continues to show a certain type of disabled folk, ones that are able to fit as well as possible into existing ideas of beauty, and so disfigured people therefore are decidedly not palatable for capitalism on screen. What we're seeing on screen is ultimately what society is saying or subconsciously absorbing, that this type of person or set of values is what matters. In our capitalist consumer culture, unfortunately, what is marketed and represented only emphasizes that which is desirable, employable, acceptable, or valuable. That means if no disfigured people are being seen, valued, or even normalized as a type of existence in the world, those ripple effects of invisibility and marginalization spread far and wide and deeply impact lived realities. One of the ways that this literally affects people's daily lives is through their income. What did I tell you? The red strings. Pretty, it seems, pays the bills. In fact, a notably conclusive piece of evidence on the socioeconomic significance of beauty and ugliness was presented way back in the 70s and 80s. In 1977, the good-looking, 37% of the sample, earned 75%, i.e. about $6,000 more than the ugly, and the ugly, with an average income of $8,000, only earned 57% of the average incomes of the good-looking. This relationship holds even with such intervening variables held constant as age, years of education, unionization, number of years with company, and so on. Good looks determine wealth rather than vice versa, as might have been expected. And this wealth gap continues to this day, even with anti-discrimination policies and laws in place. A more recent longitudinal study of American men found that even after accounting for a lengthy set of characteristics that included IQ, confidence and personality, and family background, the attractiveness premium, making more money because you're attractive, is present in the respondents across their mid-30s to early 50s. their findings are consistent with others in concluding that attractiveness is an enduring positive labour market characteristic, a characteristic that is directly rewarded in the labour market. In an op-ed written by recent graduate Rich McEachran, he discusses the anxieties of finding a job, pointing to a 2008 survey by Changing Faces that showed that 90% of people that they questioned unknowingly associated negative thoughts with facial disfigurements. These kinds of widespread attitudes left him with a near constant anxiety when hunting for a job. He wrote, "The prominent thought running through my mind in the days leading up to previous interviews has been, how will he or she react during the first few seconds of meeting? In social situations, it's often up to us to make the other party feel at ease by drawing attention away from our face, trying to maintain eye contact and smiling. This can be hard work in itself, as tiring as filling out application form after application form." The bias towards pretty and palatable faces in particular continues onwards, with direct, long-standing implications on income, which of course impacts social class and mobility. There is, however, an area where disfigurement is used actively in marketing tactics. The use of disfigured bodies to sell narratives surrounding war. For years, we've seen the use of disfigurement as a marketing narrative tool for nationalism, military service, patriotic sacrifice. While having a disfigurement might impact civilian life through loss of income, job opportunities, the military-industrial complex utilizes disfigurement for their own gain, with scholars Susanne Bernhoff noting that it's critical to interrogate and understand the representation of war and injury. She writes, "The military body is more than flesh and blood. It is a symbolic site invested with political as well as personal meaning. Military representations of the body are complex and laced with socioeconomic and political implications. In fact, scholars note that, particularly in North America, there is a whole genre of advertising on disabled American veterans that are culturally produced to fit the mold of the supercrip figure. These ads promote military service and patriotic sacrifice." Similarly, Bernhoff writes, "The concepts of valor, heroism, patriotism, and courage assume visible form and do their cultural work when they are personified and embodied. Onto these disfigured bodies, stories of disfigurement are either projected to garner pity and sympathy for the troops who have served, which lends its support to the larger war machine, or as a site of inspiration for others to serve their country. Military-associated disfigurements in this case are treated differently to congenital visible differences or those acquired in any other way." Perhaps what is most frustrating is that through all these narratives and examples of beauty and disfigurement and capitalism, at the end of the day, it's back to a small percent of people making money. It's here that scholars note, through these narratives of disfigured individuals, tireless economic and professional aspirations and pursuits, through the struggle and overcoming of psychological and social obstacles, through a persistent work ethic, that people with disfigurement and disabilities can rise up as worker crips, thus standing on the hallowed grounds of the cultural stage of marketization. So while representations and workplace equality for disabled and disfigured people are potentially beneficial, we're warned that these representations have a constant propensity to collapse into incorporation, and to thus depict the disabled as acceptable only when they are constantly becoming something other than what they are, and particularly that they are only valuable as human beings through their capacity for work. Ultimately, disfigurement can't be separated out from other sociological issues or justice-based issues of things like class or income because of the ways that we've decided what bodies and people are valuable and what bodies and people are not. Disfigurement as identity. I guess the logical conclusion of an experience shared by a number of people being tied to issues of sociology and inequality is it begins to create community, and with that, the possibility of a political identity. In the UK, severe disfigurement is protected in the 2010 Equality Act, listed within the protections for disability specifically stating, an impairment which consists of a severe disfigurement is to be treated as having a substantial adverse effect on the ability of the person concerned to carry out normal day-to-day activities. This language of substantial adverse effect and day-to-day activities is a key part of much legislating of disability, neurodivergence, and mental health provisions. But it's an interesting one when it comes to disfigurement, because social stigma, which has a negative effect on someone's life and self-image, isn't the same as having a direct effect on day-to-day activities in the way that mobility issues or blindness would. And yet, social mistreatment and discrimination is exactly the kind of thing that the Equality Act is meant to be protecting people from. This limited view of disfigurement and the realities of being a disfigured person is predictably compounded by intersections of other marginalised identities. Access to healthcare intervention in cases where disfigurement is also connected to medical needs is intrinsically tied to class and wealth, particularly in countries without free or subsidised healthcare. A recent piece of work looking at disfigurement in the UK Somali community was prompted by lead researcher Bruna Costa's assessment that we know very well how white Western groups deal with these physical differences, but we know much less about how other groups cope. Noting that charities focusing on disfigurement were keen to work with her as they were aware that they weren't reaching BME communities effectively. One key finding was the way beliefs around blame could be associated with negative experiences of and challenges around healthcare, being other, particularly reduced help seeking behaviours and willingness to seek treatment, demonstrating issues with racism within healthcare settings creating a specific barrier to disfigured people who are also Black British. When the subjects of the study did engage in coping strategies around their experiences, it was often culturally specific in many cases, including the positive use of faith, stoicism and resilience, which could be fostered in intervention. I think we can see a similar unique experience of disfigurement within queer and trans communities. Current transphobic rhetoric, for example, which has permeated the British press in recent years, utilises the language of disfigurement and visible difference to discredit transitioning as an option. Trans boys become girls maiming and disfiguring their bodies, playing on the moral panic and implied disgust that the public should feel around the concept of disfigurement itself, that it's unnatural, disgusting, scary. One of the effects of trans misogyny is the social demand for trans women to adhere strictly to a version of aesthetic womanhood that has them pass as a cis woman, but also denigrates them for it at the same time as a mockery. Michaela herself has spoken publicly before about how the politics of passing collide with disfigurement in ways that delayed her own coming out and transition journey. It's easy to see how the pressures on trans women to meet and often exceed cis feminine beauty ideals and the shame and judgment if that arbitrary standard isn't reached would only be compounded by the shame and judgment attached to disfigurement. In fact, this connection has disturbing legal precedent. In the US, across the 18 and 1900s, there are a series of local ordinances and policies put in place that are now colloquially known as the Ugly Laws. In 1911 in Chicago, for example, one such municipal code ordinance stated, "No persons who is diseased, maimed, mutilated, or in any way deformed, so as to be an unsightly or disgusting object or improper person be allowed in or on the public ways or other public places in this city, or shall therein or thereon expose himself to public view under a penalty of not less than $1 nor more than $50 for each offence." A similar ordinance in Columbus in 1891 had two sections listed one after the other. One laid out the punishment, a fine or jail time for so-called unsightly beggars, which essentially punished poor and disfigured people that dared to take up space in public. But then the second right afterwards concerned improper dress, including public nudity and wearing a dress not belonging to his or her sex, literally tying together disfigurement and queer self-expression in policy to a sense of moral disgust and criminality. As British historian Dr. Barbara Skinner points out, people living with disfigurement, as modern campaigners for facial equality prefer to describe it, just like other minority groups, have been overlooked by history. And in fact, many of the voices of people living with a visible difference or disfigurement have been lost to history, because after all, marginalised people rarely get to tell their own stories. When looking at the medieval period, Dr. Skinner notes in a paper, Better Off Dead Than Disfigured, The Challenges of Facial Injury in the Pre-Modern Past, that deliberate disfigurement was often a gendered phenomenon. Deliberate disfigurement is, at its core, a power play, a show of dominance over the victim, whether authorised through judicial channels or totally illicit and intended to challenge the authority. Male on female acts not only reinforce a hierarchy of physical strength, but also demonstrate masculinity, whether articulated as hardness or familial discipline to other men. But Skinner also notes that from her research, male aggression towards women, if at all documented, was thought to have gone too far, specifically when disfigurement or violence reached her face, and actually signalled a lack of self-control on the part of the man or husband. And alongside gender, financial class also intersects with the history of disfigurement. With industrialisation came a new type of widespread disability, machine-injured workers. Workers who became disabled or disfigured on the job were usually fired, leaving them with no way to earn a living and little in the way of recourse, especially in the periods prior to workers' compensation legislation. Looking at the post-World War I period, thousands of soldiers became disfigured, whether on on their face or through things like amputation, because of weaponry like machine guns, mustard gas, and artillery shells. In previous wars, a lot of men would have died from infection or disease before making it home, but this time the medicine was there to help control some battlefield infections, and so more men lived, and many more of those men were severely disabled and disfigured, finding their way home. Historian Jacob Newton notes that facially wounded men faced an overwhelming amount of stigmatization in British society and found their mangled faces unwanted in the public eye. Newton notes that the colonial Victorian ideals of female domesticity and men as patriarchal breadwinners caused a crisis of masculinity, where men who were supposed to be independent, hardworking, and incapable of supporting a family, now disfigured or disabled, were under scrutiny for not being able to uphold this male ideal. Bernhoff argues that the worst loss that British soldiers could have was facial disfigurement, because it was connected with a man's sense of self and masculinity. The historical tradition of disfigurement as a form of punishment, I think, is a clear connecting line through the centuries between disfigurement and sin, degeneracy, and even divine justice. It also helps continue a legacy of pity around those with disfigurement today, the idea that being like them is something that was once used as a method of torture or penal justice. In the 1770s, for example, Thomas Jefferson proposed two different provisions for using disfigurement as a type of justice. The first as punishment for rape or being polyamorous or being gay, which, obviously all equal crimes, of course. And then the second, which was kind of an eye for an eye approach, where if you disfigured someone, you had to become disfigured yourself. It's also important to note that historically, disfigurement was also closely linked to and a tool of colonialism, racism, and eugenics. Bodies and people who were deemed inferior to whiteness and its colonial ideals might be marked in a number of ways by deliberate disfigurement. For example, facial markings were used in British colonies against subordinated bodies, from the branding and judicial disfiguring of enslaved individuals in the West Indies to the use of forehead tattoos known as godna, detailing criminal status in Indian penal law. During the transatlantic slave trade, slaves were disfigured in a variety of other ways too, through things like ear cropping, branding, or whippings. Racist physicians like John Van Every, amongst others, spread the false idea that race mixing would actually lead to abnormal and deformed offspring, supposedly resulting in the deterioration of moral and intellectual endowments. Throughout history, we can clearly see that disfigurement has been wrapped up in religion, race, class, and gender. The impacts of disfigurement played a role in judging and policing bodies, stigmatizing disfigured people from birth, enforcing masculinity and gender norms, isolating people from society in punishment and justice, and in societal constructions of beauty standards and acceptability. The ongoing impact of these ideas feels clear to me even now. Each piece of this legacy has added another weight of judgment and shame onto the very concept of being visibly different. This use of disfigurement as a punishment has further solidified it as some terrible fate that no normal person would wish upon themselves or anyone else. Each relegation of disfigured characters to the role of hideous villain without also giving us this figure of a protagonist or a love interest or an incidental background character has validated these dehumanizing instincts. So where do we go from here? Do we double down on PSAs reminding people to invite the disfigured co-worker out for drinks too? Do we recommend cosmetic corrective surgery to every disfigured person? Michaela has some thoughts.
I will admit that there are times when I feel like there is too much focus on anti-bullying in appearance-related work, activism, campaigning, whatever, which is not... This is not Michaela Moody coming out to say that bullying is right. But I think you know where I'm going with this, is that what I'm saying is that it becomes a focus on the symptom rather than the cause. It's less about the systems that mean that bullying happens and more about just a quick fix. And I'm just like not that interested in that. I think that is a good tack to take when we're talking about kids and school and stuff, because it's worthwhile. But, I'm 33. Ever since since I was like 20 or whatever, bullying hasn't really been an issue. It's a lot more the things that people don't say. It's a lot more just not feeling like I belong in a place, whether that's employment or leisure. And it doesn't have to be verbalized for me to feel that. And And going back to like intersections, like I know that this is also something that people of all sorts of marginalizations feel. It's that eternal quest to be seen as we actually want to be seen, and that's where my focus lies.
To be seen, truly seen as you are. To get to the root cause of this bullying and fear, it feels like a much better option to interrogate our ideas of beauty and convention and attractiveness and normality itself than to simply accept them as the capital T truth. Even if that truth has ruled so many of your feelings about yourself and your body, it didn't feel enough to have raised all these questions, opened all these personal Pandora's boxes, and then tried to tuck them neatly into a pithy conclusion in this video now. And so I'm going to be diving into that interrogation of ideas of beauty and convention and a whole lot more in my next video with the help of the truly dystopian genre of 2000s makeover and weight loss TV. Thank you so much for watching. As you may have seen on my social media, this channel has had a bit of issues with monetization. I have been locked out of my AdSense account, which means that I'm getting no money from YouTube for this video. So if you have been contemplating supporting me on Patreon or give me a tip on Ko-fi or something like that, now would be a lovely time. If you already are a patron, hello, thank you. It turns out you can also gift Patreon memberships. It is coming up to Christmas. If you know anyone who might be interested, then I will leave all the information in the description. As a member of my Patreon, you get a number of cool perks, including post-mortem like videos about each of these video essays where I talk about stuff that was sort of cut for time. We answer a lot of your questions. And then there's also things like recommendation lists of books and movies and TV shows that I think that you will enjoy, as well as cool perks at the higher tiers, including care packages. So those actually go out twice a year, and I'm next week going to be buying all of the stuff for people's care packages for the December drop, which is really exciting. It's always really fun to do because I feel like I've gotten to know people's like personalities and interests, and I'll just be like through the year seeing something and being like, haha, Rosalind, I'm picking that up for you. So yes, I will leave all the details below. Please consider checking it out if you enjoy my content and want to support it and make sure that it continues to happen. And if that next video that I mentioned sounds interesting to you, then please consider subscribing and turning on notifications, all of that jazz, so that you are ready when it drops. I'm really excited about it. We're kind of looking more into the areas of, well, one, the completely unhinged world of these reality TV shows that I think had a very profound effect on a lot of us, but also digging more into really interesting areas I've not talked about before, like the sort of ugly liberation movement and things like that. So until I see you next time, bye.